Thanks, Taryn. Thanks, Diane. Hello, everyone. My name is Madeline Marmer. You can call me Maddie. My pronouns are she, her. I'm very happy to be here with you all. I'm a young landless farmer and an active member in the union, in the International Programs Committee, La Via Campesina Climate Justice Collective, and the National Farmers Union Climate Committee. I'm also an outgoing Region 3 board member. Today I'm coming to you from Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Andirondaran, Neutral, Mississaugas of the Credit, and Wendake Nowensio territory, and this land is governed by Treaty 13 and the Toronto Purchase of 1805. The NFU and the NFU-O has produced well-researched reports and articles by the folks in the field, like you, participated actively in cross-sector and society networks, held kitchen table meetings, and sent members to climate summits and conferences, all advocating that farmers are part of the solutions to the climate crisis we all face. Today, we will hear from three farmer members who are doing just that, responding to the crisis with resilience. So today's panel is entitled Cultivating Climate Resilience in Farming. Building resilient and sustainable farms requires an ability to mitigate and cope with the unpredictability of climate change-induced droughts and other extreme weather events. Never has this been more evident to us, perhaps, than in the past growing season. In 2021, across BC, the Prairies, and the Western and Northern Ontario, just to name a few regions, intense heat and lack of rain, withered crops, pastures, livestock feed, orchards, and vegetable fields, and dried up water supplies. I just want to offer that, again, the union on both the regional level and the national level is doing amazing work, as you all are in your fields. And if you'd like to hear more about the National Farmers Union's Climate Committee, please feel free to reach out to the national office for more information into how to join that group of advocates. So I'll move right into our first speaker, and I'll offer a little introduction, and then feel free, Rav, to go for it and introduce yourself a little bit more. So Rav Singh is a farmer. Their farm is called Shade of Miti, organic, non-certified farm that focuses on building and using healthy soil to combat climate change. Shade of Miti will help strengthen rural and urban food links and will focus on growing crops for communities that are excluded and not recognized in white-led food spaces, such as farmers markets, grocery stores, etc. Okay, Rav, over to you. We have about 13 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I never know where to look when someone's introducing me on Zoom. It feels even more awkward than in person, but thanks for that introduction. My name is Rav, I use she, her pronouns. I'm in Mississauga, which is the traditional territories of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas of the Credit. Like Maddie mentioned, I operate a small-scale organic farm in Caledon, where I grow a variety of vegetables, but I specialize in specifically in bitter melon, okra, eggplants, and hot peppers. I've been an urban farmer for about 4 years in Mississauga at various nonprofits, and last year was my first year farming by myself in a rural setting, which was really exciting. So at the farm, I focus on implementing climate resilient practices, and a lot of people ask me why I do that, because farming, as I'm sure you all know, is very mentally and physically exhausting and difficult anyways, so without the added layer of making sure that all the practices are climate friendly and sustainable, etc. But it is really important to me because although I am new to farming, my ancestors were subsistence farmers in Punjab, which is a state in the north of India. And my grandparents were the last generation to farm, and they transitioned out of farming during their life. But they were farmers during the Green Revolution, and So my family has experienced the effects that had on, their family, on their farming business, on the community. There was a lot of environmental damage that happened, a lot of loss of, different types of varieties and just crop diversity. A lot of debt, unfortunately, was taken on by the village that, well, not just the village that my family is from, but, a lot of other farming communities too. There was a lot of dependency that was created or enforced onto farmers. And unfortunately, a lot of like suicide and just mental health issues. So for me, there really is no other way of farming other than farming from a perspective that really centers our planet, the climate, and also community well-being and worker and just human rights. And although I am a very small farm, I feel that I have the responsibility to use the small amount of power and resources that comes with me having this farm and being really lucky to have this land to farm on, to advocate for and help create more just and sustainable food systems. So a few of the different ways that I've experienced the effects of climate change on my farm and kind of through like my farming journey in the city and also in Caledon in a more rural setting. Really the biggest one is just the effects to my personal health and safety of being out in the field. So each year I'm finding there are more and more days when I'm having to wake up earlier to make sure I get in the field earlier, get my work done so I can be out of there before a heat, the really intense midday heat during a heat wave hits. And it's really, important for myself to keep myself safe during the increased frequency of heat wave and extreme heat events that we faced last year. And with that comes a lot of drought conditions. So the farm that I'm at, the irrigation comes from a natural pond, but the pond did dry out quite a few times during the season last year. And the farming family that owns the land, they have been on that land since I think the 60s or 70s. So they've been able to observe a lot of the natural patterns that happen on the landscape, and they've never seen the pond dry out before. So, that's something that I'm expecting I'll have to learn how to adapt to a bit more in the coming years. The second thing I wanted to highlight was I rely a lot, and I'm sure a lot of, many of you do this too. I rely a lot on patterns that occur in the environment and in the local natural space I'm in to help me indicate important things. So, when certain things bloom, I know that, okay, now's a good time for me to make sure I get my okra out, because if this specific plant is blooming, I'm not expecting any more frost. Or once the leaves start to fall off the trees, then I know that it's time to start wrapping up the farm and get ready to hibernate for the winter. But I'm finding every year that these patterns that we've been relying on are becoming less reliable. They're changing, they're shifting, and that just comes with a greater risk for farming and the success of farming and plants surviving. And then the third thing I wanted to highlight was that I've been approached by many large multi-billion-dollar companies who are now wanting to invest in, putting rooftops on their buildings or incorporating agriculture into their spaces a bit more. And that is because I don't think it's because they believe it's the right thing for them to do. I don't think it's them really taking responsibility or accountability for their actions, but it is because there's a lot of new policies and bylaws that are being put in place that are kind of forcing them to incorporate these things in. So not like a direct effect of climate change, but it's been interesting to see how that interest has and that want for these types of projects has been increasing over the years. So I think the next question was steps that I take to adapt and kind of mitigate around climate change. So I definitely think strong policy it's not going to solve all of our problems, obviously, but it is a very, very necessary step because it can help to create some of that responsibility and accountability that I think is really missing currently. And some other things that I do, I think there's a lot that I do on the farm, but I wanted to highlight some things I do off the farm because I think it's really important for farmers to take their climate action past the fields, off the farms, and into the broader community. So we do a lot of advocacy work at Shade of Miti, both locally, and globally. So as an example, we're working a lot with advocacy groups in Peel who are helping to bring awareness to the effects that Highway 413 or 413 will have on the community and local environments. My farm is actually only 2 kilometers away from the proposed location, so it will definitely have effect on the land and the waterways that I rely on, and a lot of farmers in that area rely on. So we've been doing a lot of advocacy work around that. And I also think it's important for me to not just do advocacy locally, but also to help support global movements as well. So for example, last year we did a lot of work with helping support the farmer protests in India and also supporting the Global People's Summit on Food Systems, which was a counter summit to the UN one that was planned. And I think I will finish off by saying that I think in my ideal kind of vision of what an effective strategy for climate resilience, climate mitigation, whatever you want to call it, would look like is definitely a lot of supports and resources for new farmers who are starting out. I think there is absolutely no reason why a new farmer should feel that they have to enter farming and not do it in a way that is sustainable or focused on climate action. It can be a very powerful tool. I think if every single new farmer who was entering was provided with those supports, as well as existing farms had more resources to help with the transition over and adoption of more climate friendly practices. I definitely think a focus on local systems. I think a focus on local systems is definitely needed in an effective strategy. There's a lot that we can do kind of globally, but I think that real action does come from the local level. We definitely need more accountability, especially from governments, from these large corporations and organizations that have played a really big part in putting us in the position that we're in right now. And the last thing I will say is I think an effective strategy will definitely need to center Black, Indigenous, and communities of color perspectives instead of just rebranding their practices and things that they've been doing and are still doing as a new idea and kind of presenting it as a new idea. So there's already a lot of really amazing communities and people doing that work that we can bring into these conversations and help support to lead the way. So Maddie, I will pass it back to you.
Thanks so much, Rav. That was so splendid. I've taken a few notes and I'd like to offer 2 points that I forgot. Apologies. One is that we're going to have a bit of a Q&A after Laura and Ken's presentation. So if you're willing and interested, please feel free to offer your questions in the chat. Sunil and other staff members We'll copy and paste those questions into a Google Doc that we're all working off of. And then when we're in the Q&A, I'll go back and forth. So I'll take an in-person question with your hand raised icon, and then I'll take a question that was posted in the chat earlier. So no worries about having your questions kind of lost in the gorgeous chatting that's happening to the box to your right. And also I wanted to offer that in preparation for today, Sunil and some of the staff created 4 questions that the presenters had to kind of think about, be inspired by, not necessarily to speak to, but just to be inspired. And I wanted to offer those questions to them, to you, to also kind of think about on your farms going forward. So those 4 questions were, how have you experienced the effects of climate change on and off your farm? How have your farms adapted to become more resilient to the negative effects of climate change? Does your farm take steps to mitigate the effects of climate change? What is your vision of an effective strategy to address climate emergency on a local, regional, and global level? If we all think about these questions and those similar, I think we'll move together into a bit of a more kind of galvanized future where we're a bit more informed and scaffolded by our own experiences and the experiences of others. All right, next presenter, Laura. So Laura is a first-generation organic vegetable farmer who has been growing at the NFU member-owned Salt and Harrow farm in Swanston, British Columbia for the past several years. With an education background in ecological sciences and philosophy from the University of British Columbia, and experience as an environmental activist, her pivot into agriculture came from recognizing the central role of our food production systems in addressing the civilizational crisis of our modern era. Yep. Her involvement with the NFU began in 2020 as a climate action coordinator for Region 8, which represented a through line from working directly with land to effecting systematic change alongside generations of farmers across the country. Through agroecology, food sovereignty, and reversing the financialization of land, Laura is committed to a vision of farming and food production that can serve as the bedrock for wider societal changes towards sustainability, reconciliation, and community resilience. Welcome, Laura.
Thanks, Maddie. And thanks so much, Rav. I'm so inspired listening to your presentation. I'm going to get my screen share working. Just one second. I have a few slides. Can everyone see that? Great. Okay. Let's get into it. It's pretty early here on the West Coast. The sun is just coming up, but I've got my coffee, so we're good to go. My name's Laura Fash. My pronouns are she, they. I'm a farm manager and farm worker for 12 acres of organic vegetables at Salt and Harrow Farm in Tsawwassen on traditional Tsawwassen territory in British Columbia. New to the national board of the NFU and worked more in capacity on provincial and federal climate action previously with the NFU. And yeah, I originally got into farming as a way to kind of square my livelihood with my awareness of the gravity of the climate crisis. So when we take the science seriously and take a sobering look at the suite of accelerating changes underway, there's lots of futures that don't really make sense to plan for anymore. So coming out of university, I was at a loss as to what work mattered. And it became clear that one thing that was essential no matter what is food. And as I began to understand the dire situation of farm income and farmer numbers in Canada, the connections between our food systems and climate and social injustices and wealth inequalities on an international scale, the liberatory potential of food sovereignty, farming was the obvious way forward. And now I can't imagine really doing anything else. So today I'll be talking about the early impacts of a changing climate on our farm, and then I'll move into my takeaways for agriculture as a whole from the BC disasters this year. as a young farmer whose future will be defined by these kind of events, especially farming out here on the coast, I'm mainly concerned around the systems and the policy context for disaster management, because that's the scale where we set ourselves up for resilience as a farming sector, or get caught in high cost reactive cycles that drive us out of business and off the land and undermine food security for everyone. And these are also a key way for us to get to the table from an advocacy perspective. Big policy and funding cycles usually happen in the wake of emergencies. So BC is reviewing our emergency management legislation right now, which includes mitigation. So that's a way for us to get in and talk about more sweeping system transformation as the NFU. A bit about our farm. Salt and Harrow is a certified organic mixed veg farm on 14 this year acres of traditional Tsawwassen territory, about a half an hour south of Vancouver, and we get 3 days of sun for every day of sun in the city, so it's pretty nice down here. It's city-owned land that Sean and Susie, the farm owners, are leasing currently, and we have a close connection with the Southlands Agri-Hood development just across the road, a neighborhood working to reintegrate community with where their farm or where their food comes from. We sell direct to 6 Vancouver markets, and we do about 120 member CSA program. And our crew is entirely our paid apprenticeship program that's integrated with the young agrarians and really designed people to set people up for running their own operations. So we do different crop planning and business planning workshops, tours of different farm types and scales in the region, really trying to make more farmers. We're definitely dealing with early effects of a changing climate on our farm. One of them is sustained periods of high heat, like Rav mentioned also. These have been becoming more common the last few seasons, and they're feeding into wildfires and droughts across the province. That's why I have this photo of our regular smoke season on the left there, but they're also coming with a whole suite of changes to adapt to on the farm scale. So one thing we're seeing is shifting pest pressures. More heat can mean the different timings of pests that are coming up, and sometimes more life cycles in the summer months. So we've just really had to stay on top of our IPM and be adapting to what's happening on the fly. And in the most macro sense of that, this year we lost around $10,000 of winter produce to an early migration of ducks. It was about a month before it usually is. So that's just an ongoing battle. And with the heat wave this year, we had an exceptionally dry spring.
I love you too much.
Which was helpful in an area that's usually so wet, which is our limiting factor for getting into the ground. So in some ways it was nice for our crew to only have to use their rain gear twice and to be able to get planting earlier, but it also meant that we had to be right on top of our full 12 acres of irrigation at all times. Miss a single watering cycle and you'd see the hit right away. Certain crops loved it. We killed it with watermelon this year, but we also lost whole rotations of greens to heat, which had a big impact on us. And those kinds of uninsured crop losses to changing pest patterns or drought conditions are becoming the new normal, and they're a problem when there aren't any insurance or income stabilization options for producers who don't grow commodities or raise livestock. And then, yeah, like Rav was saying, there's been clear impacts on our crew. Also, we've had to really be on top of heat stroke prevention, sun safety, and for that August-September smoke season now, we just are in N95 masks for a few weeks. So another vulnerability to a changing climate that we're dealing with is water. It's always been really wet on the coast, and with intensifying storms and some periods of really higher precipitation out here, water control is just naturally one of the first problem areas that we have to deal with. So we have about 8 acres that were on a former wetland right at sea level, and it was converted into farmland long before we got here, but we still had to raise it up with about 10 feet of topsoil before it was really reasonable to farm it. And it's also just been really important to invest in high quality drainage infrastructure. So drain tile, we have an irrigation dike that surrounds the property, lowers water levels in the spring with a pump, and then the city can raise them in the summer if it's getting too dry. To control soil erosion and mitigate flood risk, because we're right in the Fraser River river area. Cover cropping has been really important for us, along with stabilizing the banks of our irrigation canal and bordering the property with deep-rooted perennials. But one major looming factor of a changing climate that's relevant on the coast is saltwater intrusion. So these are pretty conservative projection maps from the city of Delta for how the water will rise by 2100 in the area that we're farming. And it's pretty well accepted here that eventually it will just be underwater. And in the meantime, we're at risk for storm surge flooding from the sea, which is different from rivers because it's salinated. And when intrusion starts to salinize the water table, there's not really much you can do about it. There's some experimentation around changing to salt tolerant crop varieties, but for the most part, it's just inhospitable to most agriculture, and you restore these areas to wetlands. So a long-term strategy for us may just be to move. There's not a lot of places in BC to move. Only 6% of the province is arable land, and we have the highest financialization of land in the country. So all these issues are interconnected, but that may be the way to go. And this is a problem in a changing climate for the whole agricultural region that we're in by the Fraser River, which on the whole accounts for over a quarter of BC's gross farm receipts on 1.5% of its agricultural land. So in the Netherlands, they've recognized for almost 20 years now that dikes and even bigger dikes are going to fail, and that water is going to go where it wants to go. And the government's been buying back farmland in strategic areas to restore it to floodplains in a program called Room for the River, as a way to protect other economically valuable areas, and then implementing support programs to relocate farmers. So it might be it might be time for us to start thinking along those lines of kind of bigger scale change. But we've been relatively lucky compared to many farmers and ranchers in BC for the last few years. This decade has seen a lot of funding go into climate adaptation projects from the government and on a provincial level in agriculture, just because the frequency and intensity of disaster events is becoming so obvious. So we have the BC Climate and Agriculture Initiative, which has been publishing regional reports for the last decade or so on specifically how climate change will affect the different heterogeneous regions in BC. And then making specific adaptation recommendations for producers there in agriculture. And then in collaboration with producer associations and industry groups and AgSafe, lots of emergency management and disaster preparedness programs have been rolled out to help producers look at their own operations and be prepared for what's coming down the line. So you can see some examples of those here. And these are great resources. Everyone should have emergency preparedness plans ready and know what the risks are in their area. It's essential that we're learning best practices and responding to the changing conditions and sharing our knowledge producer to producer and making sure everyone has access to that. But in a policy context, you can see how disaster management in BC is front-loaded as producer-centric or producer's responsibility, where the primary responsibility lies with producers and local authorities for managing hazard risks. And then you have industry groups being these key liaisons for communication and education, and legislative frameworks that prioritize stabilizing income through insurance with further assistance that's kind of proportional to the event that happens. But now I want to talk about how this model was put to the test this year and how revealing it was to me that individualism just isn't going to cut it in a world where back-to-back disasters are the new normal.
Laura, just letting you know, you have about 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll go through this pretty fast. So we had the heat dome first in June, deadliest weather event on record for the region, lost over 500,000 farm animals in a week. And this was just kind of the peak of a broader drought in the area. Then we had the fires after that, which were set a new record for provincial expenditures and blew our budgeted $136 million to respond out of the water. And we had a lot of improvement in coordinated response around that because we've been putting a lot of effort into it the last few years, but still lots of red tape and problems. And we had our atmospheric river in November, which was the largest ever disaster in BC history, in BC agricultural history. 15% of the farms in the province were actually affected in the flood zone. And disaster response at this point is pretty sophisticated, like I was saying, in BC agriculture, but it's not without its problems. It's not, what's on paper isn't really close to being completely implemented yet. But at this point, even if it were, you have producers double or triple whammied from heat and fires and floods and dealing with supply chain issues from COVID on top of that. And there's, and each response is being dealt with in a largely reactive silo. That's less and less of an appropriate frame for disaster management in agriculture when things are having cumulative impacts. And it's clear that we just can't absorb this year to year. The government can't absorb this year to year and sustain a functioning agricultural sector in a model where on-farm preparedness and emergency response is emphasized over the more upfront, cost-heavy mitigation tools like public infrastructure investments and large-scale land management projects, or developing better information coordination systems. But this is why I see the biggest issue facing farmers, and especially young farmers, on climate, when it comes to climate resiliency, is collective advocacy and action to change these systems, because no individual farmer can withstand the rising intensity and frequency of these disasters on their own. And so this on the screen is a resolution that came out of Region 8 this year to the national level that passed almost unanimously and gave the NFU a pretty strong mandate to start exploring what an agriculture-specific plan for managing compound disasters would look like. And there's other models in the world that we can, I'm not going to get into, but there's places to look to as good starting points for this. So I think I'll end it there. And if you're interested in getting more involved in advocating around that compound disaster response, please get in touch and we'll loop you into the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was really, really informative, and absolutely we'll get to anything you missed in our Q&A. Appreciate you. All right, last presenter, we're moving to Ken. Ken graduated from the University of Guelph with a BSc in horticulture in 1979. He is farming at Orchard Hill Farm near St. Thomas with his wife Martha and daughter Ellen. He has experience growing a wide variety of horticultural and field crops organically for 3 decades. Orchard Hill Farm is now the horticulture site for Agriculture and Agro-Food Canada's /EFAO's Living Labs project in Ontario, which is looking to develop a no-till strategies, plural, for organic vegetables for mid-scale market gardeners. His experience with a wide variety of cover crops and years of building and modifying machinery are proving very useful. Thanks, Ken, and welcome. We have about 13 and a half minutes for you.
Okay, let me share my screen and thank you. Okay, so this is sort of difficult to follow the first 2 participants. I seem to be the old white guy. Hopefully I can convince you that I've been sort of radical during my lifetime, that I'm still doing some things and willing to change and tackle climate change here on my farm. And I've certainly seen the impacts of climate change, but not nearly so dramatic as what the people in BC experienced. So I feel like we're sort of in a sweet spot here in Southern Ontario near the Great Lakes. We did experience some more extreme heat, and it's getting worse every year in terms of days over 30 degrees. And the last growing season actually was very wet for us, and we had 2 rainfall events which were in excess of 4 inches each. And I was pleased to see that my farm dealt with that fairly successfully. We didn't have much flooding, but we're blessed with well, fairly sloping land in one case, and then well-drained land where we grow our vegetables. So we have seen the effects of it. How we adapt or have adapted or prepared to adapt. It's been a sort of a career-long objective, I guess, to have an organic farm that's a mixed farm with animals, and a good reason to have a good crop rotation with hay and pasture and small grains and vegetables. And we've seen our organic matters increase by about 50% right across the farm, and in some cases quite a bit more than that. Actually, they've doubled in locations where we've reduced the disturbance, and that's a critical factor, is how much we till. And it's particularly a problem for organic farmers because we till to prepare seed beds, and then we do multiple tillage to control weeds. So that's something I've tackled in this Living Labs project, and I'll show you a few slides. But first I wanted to present something that will give, I think it gives farmers hope, because it helps them understand the relationship between soil organic carbon and carbon in the atmosphere. A lot of times we're, I think, frustrated, baffled, overwhelmed by the numbers related to climate change, and it doesn't look like we as individual farmers can do much, but I think we actually can. We'll just advance the slides here. Yeah, thank you. So really, if we simplify it a bit, and I know it's not this simple, but I think it helps to clear away some of the fogginess and rhetoric around the whole climate change thing and the carbon problem. So essentially we have 2 problems, and often we have one solution. So problem number one, climate change is largely caused by too much CO2 in the atmosphere. So too much carbon in the atmosphere. Whoa, what's happening here? Thank you. And problem 2 is unhealthy soils are caused by the lack of carbon. And there is, you know, a solution that farmers are in charge of. We can take that CO2 out of the atmosphere with plants that we manage on our farms. And via the magic of photosynthesis and relatively low amounts of solar energy, we can convert that CO2 into above ground and below ground biomass and root exudates, which are stored in the soil. It was a big wake-up call when I realized I had 3% soil organic matter in my vegetable field, and right beside it in a fence row that wasn't disturbed, we had 6% soil organic matter. So I wasn't really doing a very good job of managing those fields in terms of keeping the carbon in the soil. And that is largely due to the lack of disturbance in the fence row and all my tillage out in the vegetable field. So let's take a look at it. It's not so complicated, really. Some of the numbers are big, but if you look at the composition of gases in the atmosphere, actually it's 78% of nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and carbon dioxide actually is a pretty small part, 0.04%, which corresponds to 400 parts per million. And it's actually probably a little over that right now. But the total amount of carbon in that CO2 in the atmosphere is 800 gigatons. But the area of the Earth is 126 gigaacres. So there's 6.3 tons of C over each acre. And then I don't seem to be able to advance the slides, but is somebody else in control there? There we are. Let's take a look at the soil aspect. Soil is actually a huge store of carbon, about 1,500 gigatons to the depth of 1 meter, which is sort of typical rooting length depth for a lot of plants. And that's almost 2 times what's in the atmosphere, because you remember from the page before, it was about 800 gigatons. And since most farmers are interested in the top 15 centimeters or 6 inches where most of the plant roots are, and where we soil test in the depth of our tillage, let's look at the organic carbon there. And it's important to make the distinction between organic carbon and mineral carbon, because limestone is actually carbon calcium carbonate. So there's a lot of carbon in that limestone rock, but that's not what we're looking at. So usually we measure the soil organic matter in our soil tests that we do as farmers, and it's about 58% carbon. And an acre of soil, 15 centimeters deep, weighs about 909 tons. So you'll see the little calculation down there in the lower left-hand corner. So actually with 1.2% soil organic matter and those figures there, we end up with 6.3 tons. And the reason I chose 1.2% organic matter was because it just happens to equal the amount of carbon in the atmosphere over that acre. So if you're a poor farmer and you don't manage your carbon very well and your soil organic matter falls from 1.2%, from 3%, falls from 3% to 1.8%, he just doubled the CO2 over his farm. But in the reverse, if he's doing a good job, you know, maybe switch to no-till, using compost, using cover crops, and managing his soil organic matter and soil carbon better. If he increases from 1.2% organic matter from 3 to 4.2, he's absorbed all the CO2 in the atmosphere over his farm and has all the benefits of a healthier soil. So very good. So we're going to leave that and take a look at my Living Labs trials, and that's an effort to develop no-till strategies for organic vegetable crops. And we're avoiding the use of agriculture plastics, which are often used on smaller scale organic farms. And it's a mechanized 60-inch bed system with tractors, and similar to what you might use on a mid-scale market garden of 10 to 50 acres, but also could be adapted to smaller acreage. And in these plots, there was no hand or mechanical weeding during the growing season, so that the weed control is evident by observation. And it's been a 3-year project. We're just going into the 3rd year now. The first couple of years, we were doing sort of a rapid survey to find promising techniques. And in 2022, we'll replicate and randomize some plots with side-by-side plots of garlic and potatoes to get some more reliable data. And the next slide. So here we are. Planting garlic into sorghum Sudan grass, which was grown the year before. So, well, actually, it's grown in the same year because we're planting here in October. So that sorghum Sudan grass was grown in 2020. We planted the garlic in October of 2020, and here we are. We're planting it in the fall of 2020. So a lot of residue. But you need that residue. You're really growing in place your mulch for the weed control in this organic garlic. Next slide. And here we are, some of those plots that were planted the fall before. Still quite a bit of residue of sorghum Sudan grass on the ground. It's going to give us our weed control. There's 4 rows of garlic in each 60-inch bed, so they're about 12 inches apart and about 5 to 6 inches apart in the row. And the next slide, you can see some beds of deep compost mulch in the background there. And here are those same plots at harvest time. We still got a bit of residue on the ground, giving us some weed control. The weeds are moving in, but we're at harvest time. And the next slide. And here are the yields. And just to give you some idea, you know, a conventional larger scale garlic grower in Ontario might expect a yield somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 pounds per acre. So we've actually exceeded that in both plots here. One was a little better soil adapted to garlic, so you'll see a better yield in the field AC than the other one, but quite good bulb size as well. Next slide. So we also looked at squash, and we planted it in 3 different sort of systems here. This is into rolled hairy vetch. So the hairy vetch has been terminated by rolling. We've transplanted these winter squash. It's a butternut type called butterscotch. And just behind Martha there, she's looking at the row. There's some planted into deep compost mulch, which is like 2 inches of compost spread on the bed to control weeds, conserve moisture, and supply nutrients. And on the right-hand side of that slide, you'll see some rye that's been mowed off. And we planted some squash into the rolled rye as well. Next slide. And here we are later in the season, just to show you that we were able to terminate the rye very effectively with the rolling, and the bed to the left here was transplanted into that hairy vetch by itself, and you can see without the rye we got much better production. There's something about the rye that was really holding the squash back. And next slide. So comparing the three treatments, the red bar is the squash transplanted into rye and hairy vetch, relatively low yield, really held the plants back. And then by omitting the rye and planting into pure hairy vetch, quite a big yield bump and quite a respectable yield for organic squash. And when we grew it in deep compost mulch, another big yield bump. But you have to realize that deep compost mulch represents 2 inches of compost, about 100 tons per acre. And this was spent mushroom compost that cost about $35 a ton. So it has to be a pretty profitable crop to make it worthwhile.
Ken, just letting you know, you have about 1.5 minutes left.
I think that's my last slide, actually.
Okay.
Oh no, I forgot potatoes. So we were also growing potatoes, planting them into a green cover crop of rye and vetch that we planted the September before. So this was about the end of April, and we're planting them with a no-till RJ transplanter. Next slide. And then we came in with a flail mower just when those potatoes were emerging and whacked the whole thing off to create the mulch for weed control. Next slide. And here we are. We've terminated the rye and vetch with that flail mower. The potatoes have continued to emerge and got a good stand. Next slide. And here we are with the yields, and you can see the average yield for Ontario. I think that was between 2015 and 2019, about 21,000 pounds per acre, and we actually exceeded that in these plots. We did have a little trouble with greening because there was no hilling, no tillage of any sort in these potato plots, so there were some tubers close to the surface, but still quite respectable yields, and the early dug ones didn't have the greening problem, so we'll make some attempts to eliminate the greening in the 2022 trials. Okay. Yeah, and I must give some acknowledgement to Fred Magdoff in his book, Building Soils for Better Crops. It was he that pointed out that close link between soil organic carbon and the CO2 in the atmosphere. And Ron Morse is a professor researcher at Virginia Tech, who more than 20 years ago developed many of these no-till strategies for vegetables, but they were never really taken up much. And Ag Canada really, they supplied the funding for this Living Labs Ontario, and we're very thankful for that. And EFAO was also supporting this whole Living Labs initiative at my farm. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ken. That was wonderful. I appreciate having the visual aids when understanding the numbers. I'm super visual, so that hopefully other people appreciate that as well. So we've had one question in the chat that is a bit more specific for Ken, but I'll hold on that just for one moment to offer a more broad kind of question and scope to all three of the presenters, and we'll maybe get to the answer of that at the end of the Q&A. So you have a bit of time to think about it, and if there's other questions that come up, we'll ask those first. So, and something that if people know me, I talk about all the time is that there is space for everyone in movement building, in organizing, in advocacy. There's a role for everyone in this work. And from what all three of you have shared, we've heard where your roles are and where you found your space. And I'm wondering how you found that. Like, I feel we could probably, if we thought about what you've shared, we could identify ourselves, but I'd be interested to understand your process of how you found the role you've wanted to play in the response to the climate crisis. Did you do that through family? Did you do that through deep reflection? Did you do that through really listening to your land? Those are just three options. So I'll leave that kind of broader question here at the beginning of the Q&A, and we'll move back into more specific questions. So Katie Ward in the chat asked a question for Ken. There you are. She asked, I wonder what the difference would be with rye. Was it purely competition or maybe root exudates? I don't know that word.
That was about the squash.
Oh, the squash, yes. Katie, maybe do you want to re-ask it if I didn't do a good enough job?
No, you did a great job. Sorry. It was just, I typed that when you were talking about your, the different success in the squash planting that was into the rye versus, I can't remember what the other cover was, but you had less success with the rye. And I wondered if it was just more competition from the residue, or if you thought maybe there were issues with the root exudates, or what you thought the reason might be for having less success with the rye cover.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's one we've thought about. I mean, rye has a reputation for being allelopathic, but I don't think scientists even understand how allelopathy works. And I've grown rye as a cover crop, which we've, plowed under and planted vegetables in many years and not seen any really strong allelopathic effect. It could well be plant available nitrogen that's being affected, not so much by the rye on the surface, but what's happening underground. And that's pretty complex. And I'm hoping that some of the Ag Canada scientists come on board, because that's part of the Living Labs idea, that they help farmers answer some of these questions that come up. But it was pretty clear that it had a pretty negative effect. And we've had other years experience trying to plant squash into rye, and pretty disappointing results.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate that. Earl Johnson, you have your hand up. Please unmute yourself, put your hand down, and ask your question.
Yes, I've actually got a couple of questions for Laura. And the first one is they raised the topsoil by 10 feet. Now, that's almost a dike. Was that actual topsoil, or was it other fill that was involved? And my second question is, that's a pretty dramatic projection for flooding in the future. And, as far as the government and the community is concerned, have they come to the reality that that could actually happen, or are folks still in the denial stage, I guess you would say? And those are my two questions for Laura.
Yeah, thanks, Earl. The topsoil, great point. Yeah, we did raise it by 10 feet with some help from the excavators so I mentioned that we're pretty closely linked with the Southlands development across the road, which was established a few years ago as an initiative to connect farming and communities in a really physical, integrated way. It's a neighborhood across the road from our farm now. And so this was an ongoing project where, in order to build Southlands in collaboration with the farm, some land was taken out of our agricultural land reserve. And the small amount of area that the houses were on, farmers were testifying through that process wasn't suitable for farming. And that's why the houses were able to be built there. But then, so as they were built, the topsoil from that area was then moved. We had it moved onto our farm so that we built up by 10 feet in order to deal with the risks of saltwater intrusion, really, and just the flooding risks here. So it was in collaboration with that project that happened. And then in terms of the projections for the area in Delta here, it's been a conversation ongoing for a long time. There's a good understanding of it and acceptance here. There's a lot of projects underway to work with infrastructure and building dikes and trying to hold back the water as much as possible. But I wouldn't say that there's necessarily an acceptance that it's just going to come regardless. It's hard for political processes, as we're seeing across the board with climate change, to really think about these long-term actions. And so while the information is on the table and the research is being funded to have a really clear sense of what's going to happen here, it's still in the works of what exactly the community of Delta is going to do about that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Earl. Feel free to put your hand down when you can. Max, I saw your hand up. You put it down. So if you still have a question, just holler and throw it into the chat and we'll see it. Devin, your hand is up next. You can unmute yourself, put your hand down and ask your question.
Okay. My question is for Ken, and it's again to do with the rye for squash. In my case, I was hoping to maybe plant pumpkins into rye, which I'm now a little bit nervous to do. But I'd gotten the idea from a farm that does a little strip tillage. So a small, I think they said 18 or 20 inch strip in their kind of rye stubble. And then plants the pumpkins directly into there, so they get the benefit of the mulch where the pumpkins are going to vine out and are kind of doing reduced tillage, but are still tilling in that strip that they're actually planting into. How does that sound to you? Does that sound feasible, or do you think you might still run into some of the problems that you experienced?
No, actually, I think it's quite a good alternative strategy. You know, and you could eat, if you had the availability of compost, and it doesn't want to be too potent. Compost is better if the nutrients are a bit dilute. Actually use the deep compost mulch strategy right in the row, maybe your 18-inch strip or whatever, and then roll the rye around it to give you weed control everywhere else. And I think my daughter Ellen is now the market gardener on our farm, and she's actually going to try that this year.
Great, thank you.
Thanks so much, Devin. Thanks, Ken. I'm going to ask a question to Rav now. You mentioned that you are farming in Caledon in some form of relationship with someone. You mentioned that there's a relationship on that land. Would you be willing to elaborate a little bit more what that relationship is like, what the dynamic lease landlord? I'm not sure. And if there is a common, if there is do you both want to respond to the climate crisis in the same way? Did you have to have a conversation with those folks about how you want to respond, and, you know, potentially going into the future, if there is, you know, the common desire to do that, what are the kind of conversations you've had?
Oh, yes. So I am leasing land from a family that owns a farm up in Caledon, and starting this year, the lease will be more of like that traditional monetary exchange. But last year, because it was my first year farming, it was the first year of the relationship. We just wanted to see how it, you know, played out. It was not a monetary exchange. Instead, I helped around the farm, you know, with they were like doing some renos, helped out with that. They have some chickens that I helped take care of a few weekends. So that was really great, and something that I really encourage, especially if you're new to farming or a young farmer, to look into, is those kind of non-traditional ways of sharing land and entering these types of partnerships. It was really, really beneficial. And in addition to that, there's kind of like an informal farm co-op on the land. So I'm one of the, I guess, tenants on the property, but there's also two other farmers who share the fields beside me, and it's very similar. They have a similar partnership with the family, and that's been kind of nice because me and the two other farmers have been able to, you know, share our irrigation supplies because we all draw from the same pond. We've been able to share some harvest, help each other at markets, which has been really helpful. And I think those types of models and that way of farming is more of that is needed, and can be a really strong tool in helping with climate action. And then the second part of your question, I was really lucky that the family and the farmer, the landlord, they do share a lot of the same values as I do in terms of, you know, like just community and climate and all this stuff. So it wasn't very difficult to have those conversations. And I don't know if I would have been able to sign a long-term lease with a landlord who didn't share the same values as I do, because especially when you're renting, you can't do, like, Ken, it was so amazing to hear, and even Laura, like these long-term projects that you both are able to work on. And, you know, as a renter, you may not want to invest in all of this infrastructure and all these techniques that that other folks who are not renting are able to do. So that's, yeah, also that was a consideration for me too. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Rav. I want to just have a quick question to the chair. It's 11:08. We started at about 10:08. Could we go to 11:20 potentially?
I'll let Ashley decide that. She's in charge of the agenda more so than I am. Ashley, what do you think?
Seeing a lot of questions. I think that as long as our panelists are down to answer for another 12 minutes, then I'll give you till 11:20 for sure.
Panelists, I'm seeing nods, so let's go ahead. Woo! Okay, so Diane and then Dawn, I see you. So Diane's question in the chat, I think this is for all. To what extent do you hear from your customers that they are aware of / concerned about the climate crisis and how it is affecting farming and food? Let's start with you, Laura.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Diane. This was really clear this summer through the disasters, actually, especially when the flooding hit in November and our markets were down some vendors for a couple weeks. There was a huge outpouring of support from customers and just generally people in Vancouver who don't even necessarily usually come to farmers markets out here. And it was kind of a mix of climate anxiety and realizing the fragility of our supply chains, and also just relationships and connections with the farms that and concern and trying to find ways to directly support. So I would say that there's simultaneously this awareness in BC as a result of the ongoing or intensifying disasters of the importance of localizing food production, and that has we're seeing that in a turnout at the markets. But at the same time, people really want to secure local food, and so in some ways there's certain vendors that are now not doing markets anymore and shifting to only CSAs. And that's having an impact also on people signing up for CSAs so they have a reliable weekly produce basket and then not coming as much to the market. So it's this, we're seeing changes, but it's in a lot of different directions.
Thanks, Laura. Rav, go for it.
Yeah, there's definitely customers, I think, especially among the younger generations and who show more of an awareness. But with that, like Laura mentioned, there's definitely aware of it, but it's almost immobilizing because there's such a big fear, a lot of anxiety around it, a lot of this issue is so big, how can we possibly tackle it? One thing that I think is maybe unique to the Mississauga area that I'm in is there's a very, very high population of newcomers here. And I find that there's just not a lot of climate change education and resources for newcomers. So there's a lot of education that I have to do at markets and just in the community around helping newcomers understand the climate context in Mississauga. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Rav. Go for it, Ken.
Well, I must admit I'm somewhat isolated from our customer base because my daughter sort of is our farm face. But I think in Ontario, I mean, we didn't have the extremes that they had in BC or even out in the prairies. So I think COVID overshadows the climate change thing here in terms of customers. Certainly there's been an increased interest in vegetables from my daughter's market garden operation, and I think mostly because of COVID.
Thanks so much, Ken. Don, go for it.
Great,
Unmute,
thanks.
put your hand down, and
Oh,
you're
okay.
already going, so go.
Thanks, Betty. Great presentations by all three speakers. Thanks, folks. Question for Laura. As an Ontario person watching in shock and awe as to how a region could go from out of control fires to out of control flooding within 5 or 6 months, I try to understand how that can happen. There's a bunch of things, there's a bunch of factors, whether it's monoculture, reforestation, clear cutting, the pine beetle, loss of topsoil protection, and then incredible rains. What caused all that? Because we're here in Southern Ontario, I saw my first accidental forest woodlot fire, so now I'm starting to pay attention.
Thanks, Don. Yeah, I would say that we should have seen this coming, I think, more than we did. When you have record-breaking fires that are wiping out the brush and the trees on entire mountainsides, on massive areas throughout the province, and then you dump exacerbated winter rainstorms on top of that, you're going to get mudslides and landslides and flooding. And for me, your question is a really good one and brings it back to our lack of awareness of the cumulative impacts of disaster events, because if we'd had a team of people looking at this data and assessing how conditions are interacting, this one should have been obvious to prepare for these knock-on impacts. And maybe I'll tie in one of those international examples here, because one of the things that Chile is doing to deal with their high risk profile for disasters in agriculture is establishing these participatory action committees. They have a really solid information system, agroclimatic information system nationally. And then one of the ways that they're implementing that is establishing these more localized committees of agricultural experts and meteorologists and technicians and farmers and local stakeholders. And they're taking that data that's coming in and then looking at it and assessing how the conditions are interacting and what it means for specific agricultural regions. And then because they're based in those regions, they can also be recommending actions on that. So that's one simple way that we can be establishing within our emergency management departments or our climate mitigation plans, teams that are tasked with that. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, good, thanks.
Thanks, Don. Thanks, Laura. So this will be the last question, and then we'll kind of move to a closing. Question for Ken. Though not as extreme as BC, this is from Isabella R. What have the effects of climate change been on agriculture in Southern Ontario? So if you're willing, Ken, maybe keep it to about a minute.
Okay. I think the number of days above 30 degrees in the summertime, sort of extreme heat. I mean, it's hard on plants, it's hard on people. And then just the extremes in precipitation, because we had 2 extreme precipitation events last summer. It didn't affect us so much, but we're, in good shape. We worked hard to keep our soils in good shape. There was certainly some effects on conventional fields where the flooding would cause saturated soils, which then caused disease, and they had some big disease losses. And I mean, we grew peaches back in the 80s, and there's certainly been a change in climate which has allowed for that, and it's probably even easier now. Back in the 1930s in Ontario, peach trees got frozen right underground, like even the roots froze. That does not happen anymore, so that's a pretty good indication that things are warming up. Okay.
Thanks so much, Ken. So we'll move to a closing in the last 3 minutes, lols. So I'm gonna rephrase that first question. and offer space for an answer and for anything else to the panelists that you think you've missed in wanting to say, or you think we need to hear from you folks. So again, how did you find your spot, your role, your space within the larger, farming response and community response to the climate crisis? So Rav, I'll start with you.
Okay, how did I find my spot here? Well, I think what I shared in my in my presentation about my family's kind of journey and connection to farming, that definitely influenced me getting to where I am now and finding the space. And I guess my formal academic education is in environmental science, and that really helped me make those connections between what's happening, climate change and farming, although you don't need that formal education to understand that and find a space, but that's what did it for me. And when I first started, after I started farming, I started getting connected to a lot of really amazing young farmers, BIPOC farmers, queer farmers who were also doing farming, but from a very sustainable climate focused area, and that really inspired me. So I definitely have to say thank you to all those people. Yeah, I think and then the last thing that I'll say that I don't think I mentioned in the presentation, but I know it is challenging if you're new to farming, and especially if you're renting and maybe a smaller scale, to find ways to bring climate action into your farm. But I think the biggest way is just looking at where you're banking. Big banks, there's invest a lot in fossil fuels and really climate damaging activities. So look at where you're banking, because regardless of how big, small you are, you're going to have a bank account somewhere. So look at where you're putting your money, and if it doesn't align with your values, find somewhere that does.
Thanks so much, Rav. Ken, go for it.
I mean, it's very personal. I think I grew up with a very close relationship to the land around me. I grew up on a farm and spent a lot of time outside on the land. So some of it came from that. And just the awareness of the environment around me. I mean, it's why we've been organic farmers for 30 years. It was, behind that as well. And then more recently, I've done a lot of education work with EFAO on soils, and the whole connection between soil organic matter and carbon in the atmosphere sort of rose to the forefront through the investigations. And I also sat on a committee, OMAFRA's committee, trying to develop their soil health policy, and realizing that certainly at a provincial level, the government wasn't willing to even admit that, there was much of a relationship between soil organic carbon and carbon in the atmosphere. And that was very frustrating, and led to me actually removing myself from that committee. At the time, I was representing the ecological farmers and ended up representing the NFU as well. So that was very frustrating.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ken. Thank you. And Laura, we're about 30 seconds, if that's okay.
Yeah, for me, it was just really I grew up nowhere near this world, but it was a willingness to look at what was happening with the climate and the impacts in the global south, and the responsibility borne in my own life for that, and then be willing to be changed by it, to actually change where my life was going. And so a lot of that was education. I got into direct action, and I owe a lot to the movements that educated me along the way. And working on a farm that has such an emphasis on political education and getting involved with the NFU was huge also. So as Coral said in the chat, just finding support, finding your people was my way in.
So wonderful, so grateful. Thank you to all three of the panelists. Thanks for having me. And at that, I don't know who I give the mic to, but I give the mic to someone.